It's Monday, the 10th February 2025. Let's take a look at the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. First, the Punch newspaper. The leading story: 70,000 naira minimum wage. State salaries raised by 90% to 3.8 trillion naira. 27 states depend on federal allocation to pay salaries. Plan 6.259 trillion naira IGR. You can get all of this story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper and above the leading story. No leaders can be effective without stepping on toes, says Obasanjo. You can get the complete story on page 36 of the Punch newspaper. Why we won't appear before Ikeme panel, says Otom Others. You can get the complete story on page 8 of the Punch newspaper. FBN holding stock gains 17.65%. Emerges best performing Taiwan bank. You can get the complete story on page 12 of the Punch newspaper. And below the leading story: free Thai nationals held captive in Gaza return home. You can get the complete story on page 39 of the Punch newspaper. Rivers community deserted as cultists kill 19 residents. You can get the complete story on page 5 of the Punch newspaper. Drug couriers excrete 125 heroin wraps at Lagos Port Harcourt Airport. You can get the complete story on page 4 and 5 of the Punch newspaper. Kwankwaso weighing Aribesola to get Southwest votes, says Kwankwasia chieftain. You can get the complete story on page 37 of the Punch newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Vanguard. Japa, underfunding, inefficiency undermining public hospital. Japa reduces health professional from 30,000 in 2017 to 90,000 in 2024. Privatize specialist hospitals for greater efficiency, says expert. Say emergency care is undermined. Canvas more government investment. You can get all of this story on page 14 of the Vanguard and above the leading story from the left. Saudi Arabia limits visas for travelers from Nigeria, 13 other countries. You can get the complete story on 25 of the Vanguard. Manufacturers fault NPA on 15% port charges hike. You can get the complete story on page 27 of the Vanguard. Housing shortage worsen as pension funds slash real estate investment. You can get the complete story on page 19 of the Vanguard. And below the leading story from the right. Let Herbert Wigwe, a builder of institutions, leaves, says Tinubu, Macron, others. You can get the complete story on page 5 of the Vanguard. Under the picture from the left, hardship affecting attendance, offering in churches, Anglican bishop laments. You can get the complete story on page 10 of the Vanguard. Suspended Edo LG chairman warned banks against change of signatories. Can get the complete story on page 12 of the Vanguard. President Tinubu wants Super Eagles at the World Cup, says Diko. You can get the complete story on page 29 of the Vanguard. Moving over to the next paper, Nigeria Tribune. The leading story: questions persist over PDP National Secretary. Why BOT backed governors on Ironwood's removal. You can get all of this story on page 22 of the newspaper. And above the leading story from the left, NECA rejects new 4% customs levy, warns it will further impoverish Nigerians. You can get the complete story on page 15 of the newspaper. Federal government steps into power outage crisis at UCH. Power Minister IBEDCMD visit hospital today. Patients not bringing generators to power wards, says management. You can get the complete story on page 4 of the newspaper. Investors favor 364-day bounds treasury bills. You can get the complete story on page 6 of the newspaper. Court affirms FCCPC's regulatory authority in telecom sectors. You can get the complete story on page 3 of the newspaper. Navy intercepts 16 boats loading with 1,000 bags of rice in Badagry. You can get the complete story on page 27 of the newspaper. And below the leading story from the left. 1 year after, Tinubu, Macron, Obasanjo, Sanwo-Olu, others pay tribute to Herbert Wigwe. You can get the complete story on page 3 of the newspaper. Leadership not titled but sacrifice. Service to people, says Fayemi. Tinubu hails his sacrifice in stepping down at APC presidential primary. You can get the complete story on page 23 of the newspaper. 2 drugs peddlers excrete 125 wraps of heroin at Lagos Port Harcourt Airport. You can get the complete story on page 27 of the newspaper. Binami won Adamawa 2023 Gomba pools. Dismiss rec insists. Adamawa governor challenges him to provide evidence. You can get the complete story on page 22 of the newspaper. APC set to hold NEC meeting. Says opposition merely out to grab power for personal aggrandizement. You can get the complete story on page 22 of the newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Daily Trust. Manufacturers, others decry new 4% levy on imports, say it can raise inflation higher. Saraki faults action. Customs explains policy. You can get all of this story on page 4 of the newspaper and above the leading story from the left. You can't relocate Palestinians to Saudi land. Arab nations tell Netanyahu. You can get the complete story on page 28 of the newspaper. Cashless payments. Commuter protest delay at Kefi Akwanga Road toll gate. You can get the complete story on page 3 of the newspaper. How I lost 6 family members to kidney disease. Yobe LG chairman. You can get the complete story on page 7 of the newspaper and below the leading story. Vehicles, properties burned as gas station explodes in Niger. You can get the complete story on page 3 of the newspaper. 2 drug lords excrete 125 heroin wraps at Lagos Port Harcourt Airport. You can get the complete story on page 17 of the newspaper. Naira strengthens by 45 naira against dollar. You can get the complete story on page 19 of the newspaper. Real estate sector to hit 2 trillion naira in 2025, says federal government. You can get the complete story on page 23 of the newspaper. Moving over to the next paper, Business Day. The leading story. Rice output hits 4-year low on high cost. Farmers say input prices have risen 5 times over the period. Millers can't get enough rice from farmers. You can get all of this story on page 31 of the newspaper and above the leading story from the left. Fintechs eat banks 80 trillion naira transfers launch. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the newspaper. Naira. Public borrowing seen pushing money supply growth by 51%. You can get the complete story on page 30 of the newspaper. Moving over to the last paper on the list, The Guardian. The leading story. 107 days of blackout. Patients, caregivers desert UCH wards as health services decline. You can get the complete story on page 6 of The Guardian and above the leading story. FBN Holdings emerges best performing Taiwan bank with 17.65% year-to-date gains. You can get the complete story on page 32 of The Guardian. Man, NECA warn of NPA. Customs charges impact on businesses, Nigerians. You can get the complete story on page 3 of The Guardian. Snakes, monkeys, others must not swallow $1.07 billion health budgets. Article 1. You can get the complete story on page 3 of The Guardian. Why some leaders suffer withdrawal syndrome after leaving office, by Fayemi. You can get the complete story on page 7 of The Guardian. And below the leading story from the left, police heeds court ruling to reimburse retired officers. You can get the complete story on page 5 of The Guardian. Serap sues Tinubu AGF over alleged 167 billion naira fraud by contractors. You can get the complete story on page 5 of The Guardian. Development. Equity concerns where controversy over proposed states. You can get the complete story on page 6 of The Guardian. IFC invests $50 million in LFZ to support industrial growth. You can get the complete story on page 22 of The Guardian. And these are the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. If any of these headlines caught your attention, do get a copy of the paper to read the complete story.
Visit Housing TV Africa on YouTube and click on the subscribe button. Subscribe to Housing TV Africa to stay updated on latest happenings in Nigeria's housing sector. Follow our social media pages, like and share our posts on Facebook, Housing TV Africa, on Twitter, Housing TV Africa, Instagram, Housing TV Africa. Join the conversation and keep up with latest housing updates.
Housing TV Africa, your first in housing development broadcasting.